Okay, so
Okay.
Kev, any dedications for this share before you start on the your aspect before I give the Gemara share?
Uh, First name for the two people I mentioned yesterday, and also for Ellen Kett, and I don't know, and for other following of Klav Israel. I don't know if you guys have any uh,
Yeah,
dedication.
yeah, I'd like to do a refuah
Yeah, there
shlema
you
for Simcha Yisrael Ben Rus, and also um, I'd also like to do it for Chayed Me'ira Bas
This
Malka.
one?
Okay,
go. Amen.
Right, no, mate.
okay. Teach us, Kev, before I go in the Gemara.
Okay, I have to just add lib here. So this week is the double parsha of Chukat and Balak. Balak is the recounts the story of the king, Balak, king of the Moabites, who wanted to curse the Jews. He said the Jews are going. It was very almost similar to what Pharaoh said. They like covering the face of the earth. It's always an exaggeration. It's anti-Semitism, like as if there's a billion Jews in the world. So he wanted. He called on a prophet, Bilam, to curse the Jews, but Hashem didn't allow it. Every time he tried to curse the Jews, it turned into a blessing. And one of those blessings that he mentioned is that anyone who curses Israel will be cursed. So that even though, and Bilam knew, Hashem told him in a revelation that he won't allow it. So Bilam played along, but deep down he still had this hatred, and he tried to be devious and do it in a roundabout way, which he never succeeded. And Balak got very upset, and unfortunately, the only way they got the Jews to sin was with the incident with where the Jewish men were seduced by the Moabite woman, and Zimri, the prince, one of the princes was committed an act in front of everyone and was killed, and then there was a plague that had been stopped because of that. But so that was unfortunately the way they got to get to the Jews to sin, because of this hatred, and that's what hatred can lead to. Even like people from the Moabite royal family gave their daughters up to seduce the Jewish men. That's how depraved they were. That's how far the hatred went. And this is unfortunately what's happened in history with
Absolutely, Kev. We're just running out of
enemies.
time, buddy.
And yeah, then they'll go to that. They'll go to any length, even to their own detriment. Anyway, thanks. Okay.
But listen,
it's
it's a very good message. We're running out of time. So I tell you what, Arthur wasn't really with us yesterday, although he was with us, and we were going to do a one-on-one, but he was going to call me, but he didn't. I think he got busy. So what we're going to have to do is just do a quick summary review. Kevin, you were actually asked some very good questions yesterday. So this entire discussion yesterday was about Rabba's opinion in the Gemara. So the first explanation that we were dealing with was, what about this 1/5 surcharge with regards to the heirs? Do they have to pay it? Obviously, they have to pay the principal. That's a given in all four cases. The Asham offering, obviously, the heirs don't pay it because the person has to be alive in order to get that teshuva for a false oath from Hashem. As far as the 1/5 surcharge, that has to go to the victim. And there's a question as to whether or not the heirs paid or not. We've gone through it in depth. The only issue that we dealt with yesterday, as far as Rob is concerned, is that he had a slightly different interpretation. And that is that, what case are we dealing with here? It's a case where the father's pouch in which he had stored the stolen article was on deposit in the hands of others when he died. And the son inherited the theft but was unaware of it. So obviously he must pay the principal. He must return. What do we mean pay the principal? he's got to return the stolen article itself because it's still in existence. That was the bottom line. He cannot keep it. The question arose, does he have to make restitution if he doesn't have the article? And one of the issues were that there's a claim against the estate if it goes to court because it's not like a oral oath. But for sure, if it exists, there's not even a question in terms of the inheritors giving it over. But the question is, why doesn't the son pay the 1/5? Because he swore that he had no liability to the victim. And Rabbi said he actually swore truthfully. And why did he swear truthfully? Because he didn't know that he had the possession of the stolen article with him, because he didn't realize it was hidden in the pouch. So as far as that's concerned, it was pretty straightforward. In other words, if you're giving a false oath, but at the time you've got the facts at your disposal. We used an example yesterday that a criminal is hiding out in your tool shed, and you give an oath that he wasn't there because you didn't know he was there. That's not a false oath. That is ignorance. And therefore you don't have to bring an asham offering or 1/5 surcharge as far as that's concerned, because you did it on the basis of what was true. So then we went to that next part of the Mishnah that stated if the thief paid everything less than a pruta, or maybe the victim forgave him of everything less than a pruta worth of the principal, he need not pursue him. So remember, there was a qualification by Rav Papa. There were two opinions. So they taught it only in a case where the robbed item is no longer in existence. Okay. In other words, the thief, if you're dealing with this case with the thief, he owes the victim a debt of a half pruta. It's an insignificant amount that doesn't have to be returned. That's a monetary sum. But if the robbed item is still in existence in the robber's possession, even if it's worth less than a pruta, its value remains outstanding, and he must pursue the victim to any faraway land. A media was used as an example, and return it before bringing the asham offering, because we're concerned that perhaps its value will eventually increase to a pruta. So what the first explanation of Rav Papa is that you've got to make restitution and return anything that you've lost, if it's still in existence, and you have to go do this even at considerable cost of delivery. Why? Because it came with a false oath. In other words, we learned that there was no false oath denying the initial sum. You wouldn't have to pursue the victim to meet. Afterwards, there was a rabbinical enactment that says you could give it to the local court-appointed agent, because it's not going to aid into shubha if somebody's going to spend more on the travel than the stolen item is worth, especially if there's no legal obligation of less than a pruta. But we're learning here, even if there's an obligation of less than a pruta, if it's not cash you have to pay and you've got the article, you've got to return it, and return it to the person. You can't bring the asham offering until the restitution is made, because that's an atonement for a sin of lying about a false oath. So the atonement is not only about the false oath, but it's failing to make restitution. Now, there was a different view of Rav Papa that says it doesn't make a difference whether the robbed item exists or is no longer in existence. Either way, the thief doesn't have to pursue his victim with any payment if it's less than a pruta's worth of the principal. Why? Because we're not concerned that perhaps its value will increase as a pruta. So we're saying something different there. And that is, although, say it does occur that it slightly increases in value, and then you bring the asham, what's the bottom line there? It can't be understood literally. Why? Because it's inconceivable that the Rabbonim would allow an asham to be brought for atonement if there's a possibility that it might be disqualified at a later date. So as far as Rav is concerned, he says, well, Rav Papa is concerned, he says, look, there's no basis for any concern. From the time that the asham is brought, the stolen article isn't valued at a pruta, so its return isn't required. Therefore, the atonement for a false oath can occur irrespective of whether the principal or 1/5 is paid, simply because it's valued under a pruta. So it's not, doesn't trigger a legal requirement. Okay, and therefore we're not worried that with the market related value it's going to hit inflation, and then it's going to be worth more than a printer. Because all that happens is if the article still exists, all he has to do, the thief, is return it to the original owner. So those are two explanations of Rav Papa. The one saying we are concerned about the inflationary index of the rob item, and the other one says we're not really. And the only reason why we hurried, if it was less than a printer, for the thief to return it to the actual victim was in order to make the Hashem offering of atonement. But since there's going to be no inflation and it's going to remain valued at less than a pruta, there's no urgency. He can bring his Hashem offering and he just simply returns the article, even if it's gained in value. If it's not the article and it's money less than a pruta, there's no legal claim. Okay, so that's as far as that's concerned. Now, while we're on the subject of Rav Papa, we were talking about this 3-bundle, 2-bundle story. So I'm just going to give it over again. If initially the thief stole 3 bundles and they were valued at a pruta each, meaning they combined valued at 3 prutas, and now after the initial theft, by the time the court case happened, maybe a year later, their value decreased and stood at only 2 prutas. Then even if the thief returned 2 of the bundles to the victim, he's still liable to return the other one. Okay, now I'd like to know, Gavin, why? Because I asked Kevin yesterday, I didn't ask you.
Well, because you have to. Okay, I can't remember what the answer was from yesterday, but I think I know. I'll give you an idea what I think it is. I think it's because of the fact that you got to return, because the value of the 3 items previously were 3. If you're giving 2, you're not returning the full article. You're only returning 2/3 of the article. So you have to return the full article. Otherwise you have to give the cash equivalent. But if you're already given 2, you have to return the other one.
Why?
The third one. Because it's because the value is not right.
No, it's not true. That's exactly the point. No.
But just hold on one second. This is my understanding. Is that either you return the cash value at that time, or you return the actual article. If you're only giving 2 items, it doesn't matter what the value of that article is. You're under giving the guy. That's my concern.
Okay, but it's not the argument at all. And I'm pleased that Gavin brought it up, because Gavin's understanding is a sense of fair play. And I like Gavin. I think Gavin's got a good point. But that's not Rava's point. Rava's point is the difference between what's legally triggers restitution and what doesn't. So what Gavin's saying is exactly what Kevin said yesterday about the moral thing to do. So the moral thing is to return in entirety what you've stolen. But there's difference, Gavin, between the legal case and the moral case. So in the next world, Hashem will hold you responsible for not making full restitution. That is a given, and you're 100% correct. The issue we're talking about now is a legal case. And it's not true with the legal case. Let me explain to you why. Because a person stole 3 bundles and they were valued at 3 prutot, okay? And we say that maybe when the court case happened later, there was a glut in the market, and initially it was winter, that article was needed, and it had a higher price. And then when there was a glut in the market during harvest time, maybe that particular article became oversaturated in the market and lost value. So what Rob is saying is, no, if you look at it legally, what happened is that they were only worth 2 prutas, okay, the 3 bundles, which means if he returned 2 of those bundles, he returned more than a pruta. And it was a pruta or more that triggered a legal case where the court could attach goods. Right. So if he gave 2 out of the 3, he's paid more than a pruta's worth. Now, what is he left with? He's left with not a pruta out of the 2/3. He's left with He's left with 75% of a pruta. Do you get it? Which means he's paid a pruta's worth, which means he's filled the legal obligation, but he's worth what he has is worth less than a pruta, and there's no legal injunction to return it, technically. Because it's only triggered if it's worth more than a pruta. What remains is less than a pruta. So you can't sue him on what he's left behind. You can't sue him. That's not enough to trigger a court case, you see. Technically, that's the issue. So,
Yeah,
what
no,
we are,
I get that. I didn't realize you could separate it. I thought you had to keep it intact.
no, I'm saying, say that you should do what you say. But say the thief says, all right, here's your pruta. I'm keeping less than a pruta. I'm keeping a third. Now, if we say that originally it was worth 3 prutas and it kept the original price, then you give 2 of them, you're still stuck with a pruta. You have to give anything more than a pruta back to the court. The court will attach goods to it. That triggers, you cannot keep it. But this is worth less than a pruta, so how would the court be able to attach it? And Kevin answered it yesterday because he did understand that we judge the value timeline of the article's worth at the time of the robbery and not at the time of the court date or the outcome of the court date. Do you get what I'm saying? So if, for example, at that time, 3 bundles were only worth 2 pruta, and the guy gave back more than a pruta, but he retained whatever was slightly less than a pruta, after the court gave an injunction and he must pay it back, and he paid it back, that can't trigger more of an attachment asset if it's less than a pruta. The only reason why we can in this case is because it's deemed the value of what it was worth once upon a time, which happened to be that the remainder was worth a pruta at the time of theft, but even though it isn't now. But if it was worth less than a pruta at the time of theft, the court can't do anything about it. You get it?
Yeah, I get it now. Thank you.
Pleasure. Okay. So, although, all right, so Arthur, if you're listening, I know you're doing medical care. Although it's presently not worth a pruta, since it was worth a pruta at the time of the theft, he's required to return it and even pursues victim with it to some faraway land. That's according to Rashi. Guys, by the same token, if he stole only 1 bundle that was worth a pruta and its value decreased, he's required to return it. So Rava focuses on the case of 3 bundles to inform us of a special novelty, that although the thief already fulfilled the mitzvah of returning the stolen property with the first 2 bundles because it was worth more than a pruta, the third is currently not worth a pruta. The only reason he remains bound by his previous obligation to return the third is, according to Tosfot, it was worth a pruta. If it wasn't, then there'd be no obligation that to return it because the court couldn't attach assets. That's all we're talking about. Okay.
And if it was just 1 second, if it was less than a pruta then, and it's more than a pruta now.
It's a very, very interesting point. I don't know, but I think in that case, he would still have to hand it over. I would think so. Just my gut tells me. I've got nothing to substantiate it, but there'd be no way that the thief could have some sort of exoneration if he had a current assets valued at. There's no way. So I can't think of any.
Exceeds the pruta. No, I agree with you. I also have nothing to substantiate it, but I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean,
I think you're right.
I think you're right. I mean, what could the thief say if they said, "But you currently have more than a pruta's worth from theft"? What could he say? He has no defense to it, none. So I think it's a good question, a great question. So now we say, all right, so what are we substantiating this whole thing? How does Rava cite support for the ruling? And we learned in the Mishnah, if you remember 96b, this was quite a while ago, that if a Jew stole chametz, because you have Jewish thieves and non-Jewish thieves, people are people. So if a Jew stole chametz in Pesach, time period passed over it while it was in his possession, and therefore there was value to the chametz. He stole Shevis Regal whiskey, but because Pesach passed over it, it became prohibited for benefit for Hanor. So it's Asur Hanor and worthless in his possession, the thief. So no Jew can ever make use of it after that point. Okay, so we're saying that if he's accosted by the court, he can say to the original owner, behold, that which is yours is right here before you, take it back as it is. In other words, he can return the chametz in its current state, despite the fact that it had value when he stole it. Okay? Now, the reason we can infer that he may return the worthless chametz now, and he's not required to pay its original value, is because it's still in existence, guys. And he's able to tell the owner, behold, that which is yours is before you. But if he happened to have had a couple of sips of the Shevis Regal, got a bit shikha, and got smashed himself mentally, and then he dropped the bottle and smashed the bottle, and the stolen article was no longer in existence, the thief couldn't tell the owner, behold, that which is yours is before you, even though the stolen article now has no monetary value because it's chametz, because originally at the time of the theft it had monetary value. He would actually have to pay the owner its original value in cash. So here too Rava derives that, where although the third bundle is presently not worth a pruta, since originally at the time of the theft it was worth a pruta, he must pay for it. Okay? In other words, if the third bundle is still in existence, he's got to return it to the owner as is. And if it's no longer in existence, he must pay the owner the cash amount it was worth when he stole it. Okay. So that obviously accords with the second version of Rav Papa. Now I'm just gonna pause the share 1 sec, guys. Give me 1 second. All right. Now Rav is going to discuss a similar case, and we touched on this yesterday. This is slightly different because it gives you a sort of different insight. If a thief stole 2 bundles that were together valued at 1 pruta, and he returned one of them to the victim, what's the law? Gav, what is the law?
If you say if he stole 2 and he returned 1, just say it again. He stole 2 and he returned 1 to the.
Okay. So Rav is saying, look, originally there were 2 bundles that were together, that when he stole it, it was valued at a pruta then. And he returned one of them to the victim. What's the law? In other words, I've got to add a bit of more detail for you. You deserve it. Do we say as of now there's no robbed item of value in his possession, since the remaining bundle is not worth a pruta and therefore is not liable to return it? Or perhaps we say why he actually did not return the robbed item that he was in his possession, meaning since the bundle that he gave back is worth less than a pruta, he hasn't actually fulfilled the mitzvah of returning anything to the owner, and he's obligated to give him the second bundle. So we're not sure, does that make him obligated to give the second bundle, or because the bundle that's in his possession is worth less than a pruta, the court can't do anything and there's no issue? That's what we want to ask.
See, I like to look at these two as one theft, and therefore it was 1 putta before. But according to these guys, you can't do that. So if it's less than 1 putta, according to, I don't know which rabbi who state. Sorry, I'm not good with names. Rabba. So I think Rabba would say that the balance, based on the previous example, where it was 2 out of 3, he didn't have to return the third one, because I think it's the same argument. Is that no, there he had to, because the value was greater than 1 at the time. Yeah, the value was less than 1 at the time, because we know that the 2 together were 1 at the time, so it was definitely under.
Okay, so the 2 other guys, I know I hope they're with us. I haven't grilled them as much because I know Arthur's got a patient. Medical patient.
I'm reasonably awake today, so you can draw me. But it's
Kev, you with us?
It doesn't mean I'm right at all.
Okay.
I'm just going with the previous example. But the previous example kind of makes sense that you don't have to return it based on the previous example.
Okay, so we're just saying exactly that. If the 2 bundles together were worth a pruta, he returned one of them to the victim, what's the law? Do we say as of now there's no robbed item of value in his possession, since the remaining bundle is not worth a pruta, and therefore is not legally liable to return it?
Unless his return was too small, That's the only difference between this and the other ones. The
Well,
actual return is below.
What we are saying
Putta.
is this
So has
case
he
is a
given
little
back anything?
different. Is
Has he
because
given back anything?
even at the time of the robbery, or even now, according to the Ravad, it hasn't changed in value. Okay, it's not as if it was worth more or not now. It was worth less than a prutta then, and it's worth that now. So that would add some clarity. So, or do we say that, listen, he hasn't returned the robbed item in his possession because he hasn't given anything worth more than a prutta, and therefore he hasn't fulfilled his obligation? Because what happens is if he returns both of them, although he can't be sued if he keeps one for less than a prutta, there's no way the court can attach the asset. If together they're worth a prutta and he returns both of them, he's actually fulfilled the mitzvah. So the Gemara says, look, after raising the this particular inquiry, Rava resolved it himself. So he uses this term, Gavin. There's no robbed item here and there's no return here. So what does that mean? So Rava's saying two things. I hope to God the other guys are listening.
It's inconsequential. The amounts are too insignificant to make it into a proper robbery, it looks like.
Yeah, so exactly. So Rava's saying two things. Since less than a prutta's worth of the robbed item remains, the thief is no longer in violation because the court can't attach assets. Number two, since the thief didn't return a prutta's worth to the owner, he remains subject to the requirement of returning lost stolen property, because if he returned both, he actually would have fulfilled that court-mandated mitzvah of more than a prutta's worth. So the Gemara says, well, it doesn't make sense the way Rava's saying it, because he's saying there's no robbed item here and there's no return there. In other words, since the thief is no longer considered in violation, how can the obligation to return stolen property still rest upon him legally? That's what the Gemara is asking on Rava. So the Gemara explains, okay, Rava's going to clarify here. What he's saying is, even though there's no robbed item here, because there's nothing worth more than a prutta where the court can attach asset, there's still no fulfillment here of the mitzvah to return the robbed item. And therefore, although nothing of value remains in the thief's possession, and under monetary law, Gavin, he cannot be sued for return of the remaining bundle. He has not fulfilled the mitzvah of returning stolen property since he gave the owner back nothing of value. It has to be more than a prutta. Okay, and in order to discharge the mitzvah that the Torah placed upon him, he must return the remaining bundle to his victim. So it goes back to exactly what you're saying. You're not sure whether or not the court on that basis can force back both. But if he returns both, they can't attack. If he returns half, the court can't do anything. But you must be sure that he hasn't fulfilled the mitzvah, and Hashem will hold him liable in the next one. That's for absolute sure. So there's this case of the Nazir, which is very, very similar to this, which we'll go through now. So let me just explain to you what this thing is of Nazirut, okay? Basically, if you look at Numbers chapter 6, verse 1 to 21, we learned this with Rav Simcha Steinhauer a few weeks ago, right? So bottom line, a Nazir is one who undertakes a vow of Nazirus, which obligates him to refrain from the following. He's not allowed to cut his hair, guys. He's not allowed to drink wine, and he's not allowed to be contaminated from a corpse for a term of at least 30 days. So we learned before that if he has the unfortunate luck of a person dying next to him, he has to take up that obligation of another 30 days. So I think he should avoid sick people. But at least he's not that unfortunate, because the person dying is far more unfortunate. Anyway, at the end of this term, he comes to the temple. He has to bring certain offerings, and he shaves his head. Okay? So in Negaim, chapter 14, verse 4, which is one of the other Gemaras, Rava said that the rabbis have said in that particular Mishnah, a Nazir who shaves his head but left 2 hairs unshaven, he has done nothing. What do we mean he's done nothing? Because there's a requirement to shave the hair. He hasn't fulfilled his shaving requirement. Why? Well, we're going to discuss it now. So I'm going to just repeat that. A Nazir who shaved his head but left 2 hairs unshaven has done nothing. He hasn't fulfilled his shaving requirement. And Rava said that if after leaving 2 hairs, he shaved one of them and the other one fell out on its own, what's the law? He is now, has he now fulfilled the shaving requirement or not? So, bottom line, a bit of background. Shaving less than 2 hairs does not constitute an act of shaving. So if you shaved all your hair but you've left 2 hairs, that's not considered to be sufficient. And Rava's saying, look, since the second, do we say that the second shaving was done to a single hair and therefore it's not deemed an act of shaving, so the requirement remains unfulfilled? Or do we say that the last hair ultimately fell out on its own and nothing remains? The Nazir is no longer subject to the shaving requirement. So it goes back to the exact same issue as before. In other words, if you haven't shaved 2 hairs left, have you done the act of shaving? Because apparently you haven't. But what happens if one hair fell out? It's not your fault. Is there any requirement left to do shaving? Because all your hairs are technically out. Okay? So there's a point that's given where not everybody's in doubt of this. You've got Rav Acha of Difti who said to Ravina, is Rava in doubt about the law of Nazir who shaved his head 1 hair at a time? Why? That Nazir has surely discharged his obligation. In our case too, it should be obvious that the Nazir has discharged his obligation. So all it's saying is that there's no question that if a Nazir shaved his entire head, 1 hair at a time, he's fulfilled his obligation, because the shaving of each individual hair is combined with the shaving of all the others until the guy's bald. Okay? So obviously, since originally 2 hairs were present, the guy's finally shaving his head, even one of them constitutes an act of shaving. If this is not the case, then how do we say that a Nazir ever shaves his head? Because the only way you can get rid of it is 1 hair at a time. You might have electric shavers today that do multiple, but even if you do 1 hair at a time, eventually if you continue, there'll be nothing left. So therefore you've discharged it. But by shaving the first of the 2 hairs remaining, the Nazir effected a proper shaving. Okay, so the fact that the last hair subsequently fell out is irrelevant. So what did Rava inquire about? Rav Acha of Difti said to Rava, we don't understand Rava's inquiry. So Ravina had to redefine Rava's inquiry. He said to Rav Acha, Rava's inquiry is necessary, now listen carefully guys, is only regarding a case where the first one of the 2 remaining hairs fell out and then the Nazir shaved the last remaining one. Okay? Because when he began the second shaving, his hair didn't contain the minimum number of hairs that can be shaved. In other words, what constitutes a shaving is if you shave 2 or more hairs. So if the last hair fell out, there's no question, there's no issue. But if the hair fell out second to last, is that last hair considered even a valid shaving? And is there any obligation that remained? So do we say as of now there's no longer the amount of unshaved hair that invalidates a head shaving and therefore is exempt from further action? Or perhaps we say it's not considered a proper shaving because initially when he shaved he had 2 hairs left, so his head remained unshaved. And now when he shaved a second time, there were not 2 hairs remaining. So the current act doesn't qualify as a shaving. So he basically can't discharge his obligation until his hair grows back and shaves it properly. So we don't know which way to go. In other words, the first hair fell out, there are no 2 hairs remaining. So he technically hasn't fulfilled that obligation. And he never technically shaved his hair properly at the time. So, but he's got no more hair, so he doesn't need to be shaved anymore. So it's impossible for him to shave with 1 hair, and it's been rendered unnecessary because there's no hair, but does he fulfill the obligation? So in other words, will he have to wait 30 days to have a proper hair growth that can be shaved? That's in the 39th daf of Nazir. So since the Nazir was legally unshaved after the initial act, he did nothing to rectify this. And the second act isn't deemed a shaving because the hair fell out and he had 1 left. Okay? So this parallels the previous one. Why? Guys, just hang on a second. There's background noise. Give me a second.
You guys are all on mute. You were.
All right, so Arthur, listen, Rava's inquiry parallels his previous discussion regarding a thief who stole a prutta, and he returned half of it. So in that case, too, he was initially subject to a certain requirement to return the theft, failed to do that properly since he returned less than a prutta, but the initial requirement, in a sense, is no longer applicable since less than a prutta remains in his possession. You can't sue over less than a prutta. So in our case, a Nazir who agreed to shave his hair was initially required to shave his head, and he failed to do so properly because he left 2 hairs unshaved. But the first of the second last hair fell out. So his initial requirement is currently inapplicable because the shaving requires at least 2 hairs. So Rava required whether that requirement still binds him to basically grow his hair back and then shave it properly. So the Gemara reports after raising the inquiry, Rava resolved it. There's no hair there and there's no shaving here. So if there's no hair here and there's no shaving here, what Rava means is even though there's no hair here, there's no fulfillment of the mitzvah to shave. Okay? So all we're saying is since the Nazir is no longer considered unshaved, how can the shaving requirement still rest upon him? So although the Nazir can't be termed unshaven, he has failed to fulfill the proper mitzvah of shaving at least 2 hairs. And according to the Mechnach's Chinuch, he has to regrow his hair and shave it in 30 days. And the Rambam says it's not necessary because he doesn't have a hair on his head. And that's the bottom line, guys.
And you think does the Nazir continue practicing as a Nazir even though he didn't the one he even though it wasn't a proper thing and he has to wait 30? Does he wait 30 days and restarts the whole process again, or does he carry on as a Nazir?
According to the Rambam, he doesn't. According to the Rambam, it's good enough. According
it's
to
good enough, yeah. And
yeah.
according to the other guy,